Nobody knows his name. That was the entire point. In this episode of The Great War, we turn from the League of Nations' first meeting, where diplomats tried to build a future, to a moment when entire nations stopped to face the past. This is the story of the unknown soldier, a single anonymous body chosen to represent every soldier lost in World War I, every life swallowed by the mud of the Western Front, every name that would never be recovered. And in the years after the war, this idea, burying one unknown soldier with the honors of a king, would sweep across nations and become perhaps the most powerful symbol of remembrance the modern world has ever known. But how do you choose one body to stand for millions? The war ended in November 1918, but the grief did not. Across Britain and France, hundreds of thousands of families had no grave to visit. Their sons, husbands, and fathers had simply vanished, consumed by shell fire, buried by collapsing trenches, lost in the chaos of no man's land. According to widely cited accounts, roughly half of all British and Commonwealth soldiers killed on the Western Front were never identified. Think about that. Hundreds of thousands of families left with nothing. No coffin, no headstone, no place to grieve. The idea of honoring one unidentified body as a symbol for all of them appears to have come from multiple sources. In Britain, a chaplain who had served on the Western Front is widely credited with proposing the concept. According to the Imperial War Museums, this idea was eventually taken up by officials who saw its power, not just as a gesture of remembrance, but as something the nation desperately needed. France was developing a similar plan independently. Both nations had been shattered. Both nations needed a focal point for grief that had no other outlet. The question was, how do you make sure the identity truly remains unknown? The British process was extraordinary in its deliberate anonymity. In early November 1920, according to Imperial War Museum's records, the remains of 6 unidentified British soldiers were brought together at Saint-Paul-sur-Ternoise, near Arras. Each had been recovered from a different major battlefield of the war: the Somme, Arras, the Ypres salient, and others. The remains were placed in identical coffins. Then, Brigadier General L.J. Wyatt, the officer in charge of the selection, chose one. Just one. The other 5 were reburied quietly. No records were kept of which battlefield the chosen body came from. This was intentional. The unknown warrior had to belong to every regiment, every battle, every family. The moment anyone could say, he was probably from the Somme, the symbol would fracture. Every grieving parent had to be able to believe, that might be my son. And that is what made it so powerful. The chosen body was placed in a coffin made of Hampton Court oak, and a medieval crusader's sword from the royal collection was mounted on the lid. The coffin was transported across the English Channel aboard the destroyer HMS Verdun, the ship's name itself an echo of the war's most devastating battle. On November 11, 1920, exactly 2 years after the armistice, the coffin arrived in London. The procession moved through streets lined with enormous, silent crowds. According to contemporary accounts, many in the crowd were weeping openly. These were not spectators at a ceremony. They were families who had never had a funeral. This was the funeral. At the cenotaph on Whitehall, the empty tomb that would become Britain's permanent memorial, the procession paused. Then the coffin continued to Westminster Abbey, where the unknown warrior was buried in the nave, just inside the Great West Door. Soil from the battlefields of France was scattered into the grave. The inscription on the black marble tombstone reads in part, "They buried him among the kings because he had done good toward God and toward his house." To this day, it is the only grave in Westminster Abbey that no one is permitted to walk upon. France conducted its own ceremony on the very same day. An unidentified French soldier was interred beneath the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, with an eternal flame lit above the grave. The parallel timing was not coordinated. Both nations had arrived at the same idea independently, driven by the same overwhelming grief. And then the idea spread. The United States brought an unknown American soldier home from France in 1921, burying him at Arlington National Cemetery. Italy, Belgium, Portugal, Romania. Nation after nation created their own tomb of the unknown. Each country needed the same thing: a single sacred place where the enormity of loss could be made personal, because that was the paradox the unknown soldier solved. The war had killed on an industrial scale, millions dead, reduced to statistics. But a single anonymous grave gave every family permission to grieve as if it held their own. The unknown soldier was everyone, and that was why he mattered. More than a century later, these tombs remain among the most visited and most guarded memorials on Earth. At Arlington, the tomb of the unknown soldier has been guarded every second of every day since 1937. At Westminster Abbey, the black marble slab is worn smooth by the passage of millions. These are not monuments to victory. They are monuments to absence, to the space at the table that was never filled again, to the letter that stopped coming. World War I killed an estimated 17 million people. Roughly half the dead on the Western Front were never identified. The unknown soldier was the answer to an impossible question. How do you mourn someone you cannot find? You choose one. You give him the burial of a king, and you let every broken family claim him as their own. Next time on The Great War, the world's great powers gather to prevent the next arms race. The Washington Naval Conference, where nations agreed to sink their own warships. Subscribe. We uncover a forgotten story from World War I every week.